Hello, and welcome everybody to According to Andrew number 89, Review of Ages of Discord. So I just finished up this book the other day, and I wanted to get a review out for you guys. There's a lot in it, a lot of good stuff, a lot of similarities to Secular Cycles, but there's also some variance and difference there. Primarily the difference being that they're looking at industrial society and the ages of discord, where secular cycles was completely agrarian societies, and the society that they're looking at is the United States right now, which is particularly relevant because of all the political discord and um, issues that we're having. It's a really good book. I definitely recommend it. I'll just go through quick some of the kind of the flow of the book. So it starts off chapter one, just kind of giving you what these historical cycles are, why we're studying them, the lessons we can pull from them. Just kind of an intro to the overall idea. Chapter two goes into the math behind it, what equations were used, how they used them, all that stuff. That way, if you wanted to and you wanted to study it yourself, you could kind of dive into it. It's almost like a very extended research paper, but I don't feel like any words were wasted in that regard. It's only 240-ish pages, 250 pages, so it's relatively short, um, book-wise, I guess. My average, I assume for a book is 300. So, and it goes through different things. So it does the structural dynamic uh, system, so that basically the cyclic cycle that you have is you have uh, overpopulation at the lower level. That overpopulation then drives um, greater wealth for the elite, and causes greater competition for the commoner class. That those commoners then, some of the upper level ones, look to become elite aspirants to try to escape their current situation, get out of that middle class, because the middle class is kind of an area where uh, you can be considered potentially a commoner, potentially an elite. It's kind of a gray zone, and in that area, you have more and more people trying to. This is where like the disappearance of the middle class. Basically, you had the people in America where you had the people that pushed and made it into the upper middle class, uh, and then you had the people that didn't make it that basically got shoved down into the lower class, and the middle class basically disappeared in America in modern society. And he kind of goes through some of that a little bit, not in those words particularly. Um, so yeah, so you have elite aspirants that basically, so there's a growing portion of the pie that goes to the elites. That makes it so that there's more people that want to get that part of the pie, and that causes greater competition for that. Eventually gets to a point where even that greater part of the pie starts to diminish per elite. So like even though they still do have a greater part of the pie, uh, it makes it so that those elites are having to share between more and more people, so their actual overall well-being starts to decline, and that's when competition starts, which then usually leads to some kind of conflict and civil war. So that's the general cycle uh, that he discusses in the book, uh, and this applies to industrial societies. There's a lot of factors that they use to um, figure that stuff out. So one of them being, where did I write these down? So your your so you have growth in social. Oh, here we go. Here's a good. So the most of the almost all of these graphs that you'll see on screen are right in the book. So if you get the book, you'll be able to see that. But if we look at here, so you got your uh, time down here, and then your general well-being, and we got employment, real wage, health, and family. Uh, and you can kind of see how these cycle, and a lot. These are a lot of the indicators that they use to kind of figure out general well-being. So, first age of marriage, uh, general height and stature, how much the real wages compared to the overall GDP. Things of that nature are what you are used as proxies to kind of figure out whether or not things are going well or not within the society. Um, the elite overproduction. So well-being. So I got all those. The elite overproduction indicators. There's a couple. The two main ones are law and business student production, especially law students, and how long and how expensive it is to get a law degree. Because if you look at most, um, what you call it, and here's a great great graph for that. So basically, the amount of years you need to save up to be able to pay the tuition for a law degree, and you can see it kind of coming and going. That's the increased expense means that there's more people that are aspiring to get into that elite status, or they feel like it's over. They already have too much saturation, so they're trying to cut people off and make it so that they can't afford it, and kind of create that bifurcation right there. And that's why you have these increases and decreases in the overall amount of cost of these tuitions. And that kind of bled over, as we can see, in the general education as well, because uh, you know general education has also been one of those things that has been going up because of this increased demand for elite. And one interesting thing that he notes, and that I wonder if it spills over into other aspects of other professions, is there's this bifurcation within the law. So if you're a lawyer, you either, if you basically make it, it already costs a ton of money to get a law degree. And then on top of that, your starting wage is either bonkers, or you don't get paid enough to ever pay off your tuition. So your starting wage is either $50,000, or it's like $160,000. And that's basically, did you make it or did you not make it, kind of level. And generally this isn't the case. Usually there's a median average, and then it goes up slowly, and you don't have this very pronounced split. But because of the discordant age that we're kind of in, we have this very pronounced split. And I'm actually kind of curious if you can see that split in other professions as well, whether or not you see that in engineering or medicine. I know medicine, it's kind of split, but it's a little different. If you're just a normal everyday doctor, like a pediatrician type, um, you get paid like, it's not 60,000, but it's probably not enough to cover it. But then if you're like a surgeon, and that's why we have so many specialty um, doctors in the United States, is because the surgeon's starting salary is like 250,000, and the amount that it costs to go get those degrees, and like the extra cost of going to like a surgeon school is worth the money you've already put in to go get your MD doctor's license. Uh, to get that like 150K pay bump or whatever. It's that's like, you're spending maybe like 50K more. I don't know, actually know the numbers, but let's say 50K more to get like 150K pay bump. So that's where the doctors kind of have that bifurcation. I don't know about engineers. I don't know about some of these other jobs. I know it's one of the obvious ones would probably be your a lot of your fake degrees, right? Your underwater basket weaving and stuff like that. Anybody that gets a job in that, um, obviously is very successful, and then most of them are not able to do that. They're in that barista phase and never be able to pay off their college debt. So there you also have that verification. So it is kind of permeating throughout all of society, which I find interesting. Uh, so he goes through that, then he goes through the different eras within the United States. So he basically breaks it into four different eras. So you have 1780 up to basically the Civil War. Then you have the Civil War up to uh, World War II-ish era, and the World War II era to the 80s, and then 80s till now. So those are the different eras that he splits it into. And the reason for that is those are kind of the cycles. So he classifies two different cycles. So there's one that starts uh, at the formation of the United States, 1780, with the signing of the um, Constitution, and that goes up to the Civil War, and that's our first completed cycle. And then the second cycle goes from after the Civil War all the way up to the modern era, and we haven't completed this current cycle yet. Um, so that's kind of where things stand, and that's why he decided he wanted to look at the United States, because there are all of these um, red flag indicators that he can kind of see that he wants to be able to right the ship on. And he has an optimistic view of the whole thing. At the very end of the um, book, he goes through and he's like, look, we haven't had great models and ways of understanding how these societies and dynamics flow. You had maybe a gut feeling of how these things flowed, but now we have more quantifiable data and ways of looking at these that give us a better understanding of, yes, this is how things work, um, and maybe there's steps that can be taken to right the ship and make it so we don't sail off a cliff. Now, with the amount of divisiveness that exists in society right now, I rather doubt that, but that doesn't mean it isn't technically possible. Um, so yeah, so he gives one thing that I find interesting. So there's a lot of different models that I kind of have floating around in my head, and I think this is a really good and interesting way of looking at the world. But there's always kind of the wonder of like, how does this fit in with the other models? And I think overall it does fit in well. I'm gonna have to look at kind of some of the edge cases and corner cases and see exactly how they all fit together. But overall, I find this a very complementary um, way of viewing the world and model of the world that you can use to complement some of your other things. So, you have the fourth generation warfare looking at the world that you can I basically uh, the Lind fourth generation warfare book and Martin Van Creveld's uh, transformation of war book, right? How you have this transformation in war and all that stuff, and is this, you can kind of add that into this Age of Discord where you have this massive change in understanding, and then you add on these structural dynamic things, and you can be like, oh, this is maybe one of the things that's leading to, it's if we go, uh, it's maybe another factor that you could add to your cyclic cycle at looking at these overall larger trends. So that one I don't see as really a big one, and a big one that's in conflict. And then the other one is my debt collapse kind of theories and stuff like that about how we have so much debt that the entire thing's going to collapse. And again, that's not really an issue. This is one of the reasons we have these cycles is because we have debt. He used like the debt of the um, United States, like sovereign debt, as a way of showing where you could have issues because there's certain times where sovereign insolvency caused issues, but it was usually a tack on. Like you didn't need the sovereign insolvency to have the crisis, but um, if you had sovereign insolvency, there was usually a crisis going on. Um, so it was more like something that happened when there was a crisis. It you never had it where it was like everything's going great and then we had a sovereign debt insolvency issue. Those two things don't correlate. So um, and he doesn't look at personal debt either. And I think, and this isn't like a knock on the book or anything, but I think that's another factor you could add into this overall model and map it. And I think you would see a lot of similar curves to the things that we have here, where you have your stature and your life expectancy and how they map to themselves. You have the debt burden of society, and when the age at which they take on that debt burden might be another good factor to understanding these ages of discord a little bit better. So it'd be interesting to maybe figure those out and map them to what's already been mapped and see what pops out from the data. Uh, looks at industrial societies. So one thing that was pretty interesting that he highlighted and talked about, and I've talked about this in the last couple when I was talking about nobility and things like that, is when the commoners rise up and the elites are all on the same page, that rebellion doesn't succeed. That's generally how it goes. It kind of sucks that that's how it is, but that's how it goes. So if you look at the Civil War through this structural dynamic demographic analysis lens, you see that the Civil War wasn't so much about freeing the slaves and all that stuff. I mean, obviously that's what they're going to tell people to uh, go fight a war, right? You're not going to be like, we want that land over there, so that's why we're going to fight it. It'd be like, oh no, that's our ancestral homeland, and therefore we're owed it, so that's why we're going to go fight and kick you off that land and take the land, right? You always have to come up with a good story, a good narrative to go and actually start a war. That's why you have the casus bellis um, in games and stuff like that, and in real life. But so the Civil War was actually about the northern, or at least his conclusion from his book is that the Civil War was actually about northern industrialist elites trying to supplant your agrarian southern elites, and because they won the Civil War, they were successfully able to do so. The Southerners were basically the ones that had a run of the place up until the Civil War, and uh, with Lincoln coming in and the expansion of the states, they saw their power slipping, so that's why they ended up kind of deciding, all right, Civil War time, we're gonna dip, which according to the Constitution they did legally have the right to do. Um, but the Civil War was fought, they lost, and they got supplanted by your industrial northern, and that's where you get the so you go from your antebellum uh, southern uh, colonial type attitude and elite um, feel to your WASP. This is when the WASPs take over, your white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. That's where you have that changeover. Um, and then we can obviously see that the industrialists are the ones that dominated late 1800s, early 1900s society until the Progressive Era. And the Progressive Era caused a lot of issues for them because they wanted to keep wages low, so they kept flooding America with migrants, and that caused a lot of pressure on wages, mainly because people are coming from Europe and they're landing on the eastern seaboard, and there was a ton of land, but it's already a big journey to get to Europe from Europe to America, then to go from the eastern seaboard and basically go all the way west. You're going across like almost half the world to have to just to find a spot that you can kind of settle down. So basically, this caused a concentration of people within the eastern seaboard. We still see, it's the most heavily urbanized area in America today still, and this basically suppressed wages, which was good for the industrialists. They wanted to do that, but eventually it led to a breaking point where actually the political instability of the time was higher than before the Civil War. If you're not familiar with the era, there was a lot of anarchists, bombings, presidential assassinations. That's how what's his name, Teddy Roosevelt became president. He was never actually elected. He was vice president, and then I think William McKinley was murdered or assassinated, and he became the president. And it was by these anarchists of the early 1900s, a lot of times communist based, pretty much exclusively communist based actually. Um, and so this presented a greater threat. That threat of being thrown out of power presented a greater threat to them personally than raising people's wages a little bit and coming to compromise on a lot of union type stuff. So that's where this is one of the things that kicked off the progressive era was, uh, and shutting down the immigration and all that stuff from this era is the benefit from importing these people from Eastern Europe was lower than the lower wages was disadvantaged by the fact that they had these ideas of communism and stuff like that they were bringing over, and they were much more likely to try to form unions and things like that within society. So that's where they shut things down and things started to improve, and that's where you kind of have some of these improvements through the Gilded Age. Obviously, we have the Great Depression that kind of messes things up for a lot of people. But we get through that, we get to World War II, and then we have a very successful era. And so we did have a lot of issues, but we were able to get through them without too much issue, I guess is the best way of saying it. Um, so and one thing, just kind of on a side note, the so one of the indicators that they use is first for general well-being is the first age of marriage, and it's not this one. One of these has first age of marriage in it. Maybe they don't. Nope. Okay, I guess I didn't download that one, but um, let's just use this family one. So, interestingly, the age of first marriage was the lowest it has ever been in American history during the baby boomer generation in the 1960s, which is kind of crazy because generally when we think about when the age of people get married and stuff like that, it's, oh, when they were out in the 1800s and they need to get married super young so they could have like 12 kids so they could run the farmstead and stuff like that. And that was definitely a factor back then. But it's interesting to see that the economic well-being allow in the 1860s, or like the post World War II American era, allowed for such economic opportunity that people felt economically secure to start families at, I think the average was like 21, which is crazy that that's the average. That means like almost everyone's getting married like 18 to like 21, basically. Like you have to have a lot of people below 21 because you're gonna have your people that are getting married at 30 and 40 and stuff like that. Well, 40 is a little high, but um, I just found that very interesting. That we generally we think of like people getting married young and having large families and stuff like that as a thing of the previous eras, and that and it's an interesting factor that that was the lowest age of marriage was in the 60s. There's a lot of other issues and psychological operations that happen around there, but that has nothing to do with Age of Discord, so we're not going to touch on that. Um, oh, I also wanted to highlight, so on my last video I talked about elite overproduction and how to kind of combat that, and one of the things I didn't factor in to the overall aspect of that was that when the commoners get squeezed, a lot of those commoners are going to seek uh, become elite aspirants, and even if the path and the likelihood is um, risky or dangerous or something like that, uh, a lot of times the risk is worth it because, and that's one of the reasons that, and one of the ways they can keep selling college is like right now it's kind of flipped where not going to college, there's better options. You can be a welder, you can be some of these other things that are very well paying, but for a while, part of it was just a lie, but part of it was like this is your only option. Like this is a bad option, and it's like the likelihood things work out is not good, but it's still like, and this is basically the selling line. Like it's not a good option. There's a lot of downsides to it, and the probability that you succeed is low. But the probability that you succeed if you go the other route is basically zero. So you have to do this. Um, and so that puts a lot of pressure on a lot of the institutions and stuff like that that I was talking about of limiting elite overproduction, because if you're in that kind of situation where people risk almost anything to get into those ranks, it's going to be hard to completely shut people out without causing some form of instability. So I just wanted to add that little note. Probably putting that 23 minutes into the video, probably not the best idea. But and then one last little thing. So as I was reading through, there's an interesting aspect where Church and State, a newspaper, I think it was a business magazine, with an interesting perspective on big business. Um, so I've talked about the Middle Ages a lot and how you had these different uh, groups that kept each other in check. So you had the church, you had the crown, the nobility, and the towns. So basically a not a power vacuum, but a lot mass consolidation happened in the 1700 or 16 1700s, early modern period of those institutions where the nobility got subsumed by the crown, the church kind of became subservient and lost a lot of its political power to the crown, and the towns basically didn't have the military might to resist the crown. That's kind of how it went. And so basically the state is now the sole, it's not the sole one, but for the most part it is kind of the sole arbiter, and most other things work within its structure instead of being separate outside political entities that are fighting for top dog status. You're like, the state will always be the top dog, and you're just working to try to get the highest placing within that system. That's kind of how our modern state system works. So but to this still is within the state system, but an aspect of that secondary rivalry, political power, kind of rose up in the early 1900s. And Churchill makes point of this through this newspaper that had this rating back then, which is rather interesting. Uh, so it has an interesting perspective on big business. It rose up as a response to government pressure, similar to how unions are effective tools for workers to get better conditions through worker consolidation. Business consolidation was necessary to amass the influence needed to resist and counterbalance political forces. Similar to how the nobility and the church counterbalanced the crown in the medieval period. So what I mean by consolidation is, they say big business is the biggest fan of government, and to an extent that's true. But a lot of these conglomerations and stuff like that were a response to a lot of the political. The political class had no check on their power, and so they could kind of do things to business, and there was no effective means to fight them. And so one of the ways that they could fight them is the ones that were particular business savvy were able to buy up a lot of the small ones, become a kind of political tool. Think your Facebooks and Googles and stuff like that now, and really resist the governments and stuff like that. I mean, like they obviously worked hand in hand with them to an extent as well, but you get some concessions. It's a compromise. Like, all right, you're gonna back off on this thing here, and you're gonna let us, run workers into the ground and bring in scabs to break up union strikes and all this stuff. And in exchange, we'll do XYZ regulation that you guys put in. And so you kind of have, the libertarian, not argument, but issue with big business and big government kind of wedding themselves together, and the problems that come from that is relevant in this context. But it's in a sense it was a response to political pressures. Everything's dynamic. Everything's got costs and benefits and downsides and upsides, and so big business is an issue, and it's a problem. And currently, we like to break up a lot of the stuff right now. But if you have just mom and pop shops everywhere, which I do enjoy, they don't have the political coherency to push back against overregulation and stuff like that. And so, even though some of that overregulation does help those big businesses, there are aspects of it that they prevent governments from putting in some of their worst instincts or intentions would have them do. So those are just kind of my thoughts on the book and what it's about. Whether or not I think you should read it. I think it's a good read and worth your time, in my opinion, especially if you're interested in what Peter Turchin calls kaleidodynamics, basically the aspect of looking at society at large and all the different aspects that go into shaping and forming a society. So I think it was a really cool book and really interesting. Taught me a lot, and was worth the read. Do recommend. But anyway, thank you guys for listening. You can find me on YouTube, BitChute, and Podbean. And hopefully you guys found this interesting and have yourselves a good day. Goodbye.